lot about our paper, and he's more. He has a fluent English speaker, so I prefer that he speak for me. But you have to know that we project our book here in Villa Mirafiori, on the hill over there. There are seats, one in front of each other, and we write the first index of the book, I remember. In 2040, I remember. 14, okay. Marco, I give you
the microphone.
This is our book.
Yeah.
This is our book.
Yes, because when we were writing for a critical history of psychotherapy, actually we have written a critical theory of therapy, or psychotherapy, or a first version of a critical history of psychotherapy. And this is the English version, translated in 2022 for Routledge. The first edition was published in 2020 in Italian by Raffaello Cortina. Well, there are many problems in speaking about this since the problems of the title somehow, because Renato and I were speaking with David Robinson yesterday, who was one of our first readers. We are very honored to have David Robinson as one of the first readers of the English version. And one of the things he told us was that when you write something like a critical history of psychotherapy, you tell to the other people probably that you want to be discussed, that many people won't agree with you. And this is possibly true. Probably it was not our first intention, but actually it was what the work became is something like that. So we have to clarify something about the title itself somehow. For example, the first thing should be why a critical theory, because we don't think it's possible to write the critical theory of psychotherapy. We have a partial perspective, of course, and we are proud of having a partial perspective. We somehow adopt a perspectivist way of doing history. And so this is one possible version of the history of psychotherapy. Why critical? Someone in Italy asked us, so you want to criticize psychotherapy? Not at all, of course. I think that it would be obvious for almost every one of you saying something like that. But of course, critical comes from the Kantian word. Critical means that we want to adopt a line that allows us to make some judgments about the history of psychotherapy. And not criticize, but, well, when we go back to Kant, when he wrote the Critique of the Pure Reason, meant that he wanted to build a tribunal of the pure reason in order to have the chance of judging what is possible for the reason to do and what is not possible for the reason to do, on the basis of principles. And so somehow we want to, in a similar way, si parva licet, the Latin say, if it's allowed to us to compare something very small to something very big, we wanted to make some judgments to say what is possible, what is not possible for psychotherapy somehow. Why? What kind of history? This is another problem, because there are, of course, many ways of writing history, and David, I quoted you a few minutes ago, but let me tell you. Well, first thing is that we try to put psychotherapy in the context. So we try to do external and internal history of psychotherapy. So to put the history of psychotherapy in the context of the general history, of the global history. And we also tried to do a history, a general history of the psychotherapeutic phenomenon. So we tried not to write different histories for the different kind of psychotherapies, but to write a general history of the phenomenon of psychotherapy. This is, of course, a possible perspective. This is not a necessary perspective, and this is also a subjective perspective, we have to say it, because, of course, is not even possible, but it's necessary to write the histories of psychotherapies. I'm very proud of being part of a project by Sonu Shamdasani, a project about the transcultural histories of psychotherapy, and so to make different histories and to study the different particular periods and the different particular protagonists of the history of psychotherapy in different contexts. But in our opinion, is also necessary, or is also a possible and interesting perspective to study a general history of the phenomenon of psychotherapy. But when we speak about psychotherapy, we have the third important problem. Is it possible to define psychotherapy? Because according to the different definitions of psychotherapy, we can do different kind of histories, of course. And the problem is that if we adopt a deflationary definition of psychotherapy, meaning we define by psychotherapy only what is called psychotherapy by people who practice it, this could be a problem. Why? Because, for example, just to make a very simple example, Lacanians would never call psychoanalysis a form of psychotherapy. And there are also other people that wouldn't call psychotherapy a psychotherapy, since they don't believe in the idea of the psyche. So, for example, there are some behavioral therapists who don't believe in the idea of the psyche at all, and they believe only in the change of behavior, and they wouldn't speak about psychotherapy for their practice. So a deflationary definition of psychotherapy doesn't work, in our opinion. So we tried to use this particular definition, cures for the psyche by the psyche or through psychic interaction. It was, of course, a very discussed definition, because, of course, many people who do psychotherapy in our definition, as we were saying, wouldn't define their practice as a kind of psychotherapy. But this kind of definitions allows us to build an edge. Inside it we can somehow build an history. Sono Shamdasani defines some in one of his numerous papers psychotherapies as ontologies aimed at changing the nature of patients. This doesn't mean, of course, that this is a general definition of psychotherapy, in his opinion, I think, but the implication is this kind of definition, in my opinion, are very interesting because it allows us to building this together, putting these two definitions together, to define as psychotherapy kind of cure that are not usually defined as such. When we are speaking about psychotherapy, we can start from the very definition of it. And the definition should be based from etymology. And the etymology comes from two Greek words, which are therapeia, which means care. Originally, therapeia meant care of the body or service, not what we today know as being called psychotherapy. And psyche originally was the meaning of the last breath, and only later it became soul. In the archaic Greece, the only recorded function of the psyche in relation to the living man is to live him, says Dodds in his very famous book about the Greeks and the irrational. The idea of a soul independent from body comes from the Orphism, and the idea of a soul pre-existing and surviving the body comes from Empedocles and Pythagoras. So the idea of therapeia tes psyches comes from Greece, and the first reference to a therapeia tes psyches is in Plato, where therapeia tes psyches is something related to the good discourses made with people who are able to improve you. So it's something really related to this idea of cure for the psyche, by the psyche, or through the psychic interaction, and also related to the idea of the ontologies aimed at changing the nature of the patients. Of course, when we are speaking about a history of psychotherapy, the main problem is where do we start? So, should we speak about an idea of continuity? And so it's possible to really speak about a form of psychotherapy in the Greek world. So does, for example, Epicureanism or Cynicism or Stoicism, could they be defined as forms of psychotherapy? Well, somehow I think so, we think so. Starting from the fact that actually cognitive therapy relates to Stoicism in a way. Ellis explicitly says that his ideas are somehow really related to Stoicism and also to Paul Dubois, as you know. So somehow we tried to do a general history who spoke in terms of continuity, but without forgetting that when we speak about something like psychotherapy in the ancient Greece, this is something completely different from the psychotherapy developed in modern times. So there are very different approaches to this problem. For example, David Robinson here, no, not the other Robinson, not David. Daniel Robinson. No, the other D. Robinson. So I'm very sorry.
I'm with Dan Sicker.
So there would be two different D. Robinsons speaking about, and this is very interesting for this discourse. So I'm sorry for the misquotation. So there is authors like Saulo Araujo. I know Saulo, so I'm sure that he means this. That speak about the idea of the continuity between philosophy and psychology, and also other important authors like Danziger and Brock that are for the idea of discontinuity in order to have a more complex and multifactorial view of contemporary psychology. So we try to find somehow a beginning inspired by the words of Pierre Duhem, that somehow when you find a beginning, there is something that you can find in the history that could be somehow related to the same things but written previously somehow, so you can go backwards ad infinitum in a way. But so we try to do somehow something like a history of ideas, meaning that in order to understand the modern meanings of some ideas, it's important to understand also the previous meanings of the same ideas. So we don't want to do a history meaning that everything is completely related and the evolution is something necessary, but we want to reconstruct how some ideas, what we call the paradigmatic ideas, because there is no paradigm in the history of psychotherapy before modern psychotherapy. But there are some ideas that comes from the ancient Greeks that could be followed in their development in the course of history. For example, the meaning of the dream. The meaning of the dream is completely different in ancient Greece, and in Freud, for example. But there is an evolution of the idea of the interpretation of the dream that should be studied in order to better understand Freud's ideas. So somehow we try to do a history of psychotherapy that is not a history of islands, but also the history of the sea between the islands, so to say. We want to say also another thing about our cultural environment in Italy, speaking about psychotherapy, because the culture of psychotherapy in Italy is very particular confronted to the culture of psychotherapy abroad, because the idea of psychotherapy is so important in Italy that somehow the number of psychologists and psychotherapists in Italy is higher than in the rest of Europe, including United Kingdom. So from the 1960s, the interest in psychology and psychotherapy in Italy has grown really very much. From the original ideas of what you call the boomers, from the 60s, that the personal is political. So the idea of the personal is political developed in the 60s, in the late 60s, into an interest about the idea of psychology and psychotherapy that was paramount in Italy somehow. In this, the role of psychoanalysis for the development of the interest in psychotherapy in Italy was also paramount. The the two most important people developing the influence of psychoanalysis in Italy were Ossicini and Pier Francesco Galli. And Ossicini is also the father of the 1989 law that established the idea of the Ordine degli Psicologi, which is the official list of the psychology stated from the Republic. No, I don't know how many countries outside Italy have something like this, which means an authorized list of psychotherapists, of psychologists and of psychotherapists. This was established in 1989, and this is what it means today to have something like, I don't know, something like 600,000 psychotherapists, psychologists and psychotherapists in Italy. So there are incredibly many people, not so many people actually are practicing, but as many people studied, and in order to become a psychologist, it is necessary in Italy to have 5 years of study, a second degree master, and afterward one year of practice under the control of a professional. And to become an official psychotherapist is also necessary to study 4 other years in a school recognized by the state. So it's really incredibly regulated, confronting it from with other nations abroad. The interest for the sciences started after World War II, but as I told you, the topical moment was 1968 with the idea of the personal is political. And since we have so many people interested in psychology, and since we have a so specialized psychological model, there was a very particular polarization between the medical and the psychological model. So in Italy we have really many persons who call them psychotherapists who are not physicians at all. We have many psychoanalysts who are not physicians at all. Where it's possible. 5 minutes, okay. The last thing that is important in order to understand our culture is the movement of radical psychiatry. But this is also a story that you might know, but it would take too long to speak about this. So I'd like to tell you something about the choices that we made in order to build the history. The first, of course, I already told you to speak about the internal and the external history. So the history of psychotherapy is meant to be not only a history of theories and a history of practices, but also a theory of the relationships between the theories, the practice, and the general environment. Also, we tried to, when possible, also to speak about the different actors in the history of psychotherapy, not only the theorists, but also the patients when it's possible. So, for example, you know that Regine Place wrote a book in 2000, I think, saying that probably the change of paradigm between French the French movement, the French paradigm of suggestion, of hypnosis, and the Freudian paradigm of free association was not only related to the idea, to a Freudian idea that suggestion is not the ideal way of practicing, but also to the fact that patients are different in France and in Vienna, because okay. No, because they are cited together in
okay.
No, it's very funny because we, of course, when we wrote the book, we tried to write it together as possible. But the original chapters were the original part of the chapters were written singularly, but everyone. But only one of us, and afterwards we confronted our ideas. But the original part about this was written by Renato. Sorry. Also, we speak very much about the French legacy. We dedicated very much about the Freud's role in the history of psychotherapy, not because we think that Freudian theory is the most important theory in the history of psychotherapy. Possibly it is, but it's not the point. The point is that most people doing history, who are the actors of the history of psychotherapy, somehow related to Freudian theory, possibly to say that they wouldn't disagree with Freudian theory, but somehow Freudian theory is the target of their criticism in order to do something else, is somehow, in a way, a point of departure of most of the theories. Jung, for example, developed a very different theories from Freud's, but many times in every book he quotes Freud, he refers to Freud. So even if it's impossible to say that the Jungian theory wouldn't have been produced without Freud, as many people could think, this is not the case, but without Freud, analytical psychology would have been surely completely different. Many protagonists of the history of psychotherapy started as psychoanalysts. Ellis was a psychoanalyst, Beck was a psychoanalyst after him, and possibly the only theory developed without any relationship with the Freudian theory was Bateson theory. Well, Dubois was developed before Freud, so it's it's impossible to say yet, but he ignored Freud at all, in a way. And the last thing before we finish is about what we call the final notes of the question. I don't think I have very much time to speak about this, but just to mention it. What is important for the future of the history of psychotherapists and the future for the psychotherapy is the ideas about the role of the therapist. Not only when we are speaking about what the therapists do in therapy, but also about who is the therapist. What is the ideal model of the therapist? Is the therapist someone who is the bringer of truth, for example? Is the therapist a tamer? The different conception of what is the role of the therapist are very important for the development of the theory and also for the development of the history of psychotherapy. The role of the patients, we already mentioned this. I say we because I'm speaking on behalf of Renato as well. The problems of the integration and hybridization of psychotherapy, because it is also incredibly important, because some therapists tend to use different techniques without the effort of building a theory of the therapy. The idea of the mind-body problem, should psychotherapy related to neurology, as many people think today, or should become, or should stay something relatively unrelated to the functioning of the brain? And in the end, what's the general meaning of psychotherapy? It's correcting people or empowering people, and with the different meanings, we have also different meanings of the history of psychotherapy, not only of the psychotherapy in itself. Well, this was something about Marco.
There are so many things to say about this psychotherapy, but we are ready for your questions. You have a shelter, Marco. Shelter. You have a shelter for us now for the questions. Ecco, the first question.
Yeah, thank you. This was a really, I really liked the presentation to give us some context for your book. I have a question actually not about the history so much as about the future and the role of the therapist. Because now we also start to see all of these, this is what Liz Lundberg, I saw her give a talk recently on this, the role of these apps, and that the therapist is no longer even a person, but that you go on a website or you go on an app and somehow this gives you psychotherapy. So do you see that linked to these currents as well?
Can I try to answer? At the end of our book, you find that, in my opinion, but I think also in the opinion of Marco, the therapy is a relation. So I don't think that artificial intelligence can substitute a good therapist. In this sense, we are psychoanalysts. Because psychoanalysis, for psychoanalysis is very important the relation and the dynamic transfer and contrast.
Psychology rather than I'd say depth psychology rather than psychoanalysis, because when you refer to psychoanalysis you refer to Freud.
But the dynamic psychology is very important because at the end of the book you find our critics to modern model of therapy without relation. EMDR for an example and so on.
Yeah, this refers also to another problem. The problem is, what is history? Because is the future history? But it's very important this to, should we write history in order to understand the present and to interpret the possibilities of the future? I don't have an answer, And for example, what should we write? What should we decide to write about? For example, we wouldn't have written about EMDR if our publisher in Italy wouldn't say you have to write about EMDR, because it's important to understand that EMDR is an important factor in psychotherapy today. Also because he publishes manuals of EMDR, I think. But
there are a lot of people that study MDR, a lot of students, our students study.
But is it history? I really don't have a definite answer for this.
Grazie Marco Antonio and Renato for this precious work. I was thinking that a very important chapter or issue in this history is the process of circulation between some known central countries or some very interesting movement. For instance, in Brazil, our psychiatry reform is completely made in Italy. Basaglia influence is very strong in the definition of a kind of national policy of health in Brazil. But you have also very interesting movements. For instance, it's impossible to understand psychotherapy or even psychoanalysis in some countries like Brazil without the presence of Argentinian psychoanalysis. It's very interesting to observe the circulation and the kind of differential and local appropriations of these differences, theory and practice. I think it's very important to this history. Thank you.
I would like to say something about Basaglia, and I would be clear about Basaglia. Basaglia hates psychotherapy, completely hates psychotherapy, because they think that psychotherapy was a positivist solution like psychiatry. But the pupil of Basaglia, and he was the pupil of Basaglia were very interested in psychotherapy. So the radical movement helped psychotherapy in Italy. But there are radical psychiatrists that are against psychotherapy, as Basaglia.
Yeah, it's something like habent sua fata libelli, no? In a way, the destiny of some books is not what were meant to be. For example, if you remember in another context, the Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, was written as a very optimistic book in the intention of Hermann Hesse, and actually was the manifest of the young existentialists in the 70s, and so he was really perplexed by this. But okay, if you like it, you can read it any way you want. And for Basaglia was something like this also, because he was somehow responsible for the law in Italy. The first law about the closing of the asylums is a law written in Italy, and this is called the Basaglia law, even if Basaglia didn't write it at all. The person who wrote the law was another doctor, was
Orsini,
yeah.
But Osticini helped the passage of the law in Italian Parliament. Osticini is a very interesting person, but we have to write about it.
Inflation or inflation is hard.
Thank you. I really like the broad conception of Psychotherapy that you use here, because it's also something that's really in line with what I like to do. But I really connect a lot of the more modern psychology and development of it regarding pastoral care practices, and I presented on it the last two ESHHS conferences. So I was really wondering, why, do you incorporate it? How do you deal with the breadth of that side of it, and why do you not?
think that we incorporated modern psychology. We do. We did. We follow from chapter 3. We follow decades. The first chapter. The first chapter is an epistemological and chapters, and the second chapter is about the history of the connection with the ancient history. We know very well that you are not Daniel Robinson. Daniel Robinson was a continuist. David is not continuist, so.
Yeah. My question was, you used the antiquity conception of it, and kind of follow it, and relatively jump to psychotherapy. And I'm wondering about all the pastoral care practices. So, and I've been mostly working on the Protestant ones, but also things that your lawyer, Ignazio,
Ok, allora we work and I work and we work on exorcism. Okay, on exorcism. But exorcism is a different kind. There is a discontinuity between the pastoral. I don't think that the priest was the psychotherapy was exactly a secularization of the pastoral behavior. There are connections. We talk about the connection. In Italy, we have tarantism. We have tarantism in Italy. Also, tarantism is a form of therapy. Okay, for me, maybe tarantism is more connected with psychotherapy because tarantism is the root of the study of hysteria.
Well, it's very difficult because also there are the problem of continuity and discontinuity. No, is the main problem. No, because it's impossible to speak about a secularization, psychotherapy as a secularization of the work of the priest, but somehow. When we read Carl Gustav Jung, Jung says that one of the forms of psychotherapy is confession. The first step of psychotherapy, and in many cases the only necessary, is confession, because sharing a secret could be in itself something that can lead you to mental health, no? Because having a secret in one single person is poison, but sharing a secret is a form of therapy somehow, and this is also, according to Jung, the general idea of the occultist society, of the this is important also. According to Ellenberger, I don't know anymore. The exorcists were somehow people that worked based on transference, no? But they didn't use transference in a conscious way. So the perspective can be of course, very different. But I hope you can read our book and we can keep on discussing about this.
How much did you put on the Catholic route here? So the things you're saying are very Catholic based on this. And I'm very much within the German Protestant side of this part, and it's very much more similar to the psychotherapy.
There are maybe the spread of psychotherapy in Italy is because we have a Catholic culture. But our book is not about the Catholicism and the history of Catholicism in connection with the history of psychotherapy, because in our opinion you find a lot of point of reference to exotericism in our book, or to other culture, not just Christian culture or Catholic culture. There are a lot of point of reverie in the history of psychotherapy, and they are not all religious point of reverie.
Of reference.
Okay, so thank you.
Okay.
Allerlei sectarische problemen. Grazie.